The boy sat alone at the end of a long cafeteria table, his lunch tray untouched in front of him, while 30 other 7th graders laughed and shoved each other and lived their loud, careless lives around him. His name was Carter Whitby, and today was his birthday. Nobody knew. That was the part that made it worse. He had a small cupcake in a plastic container that he'd packed himself that morning. Chocolate, with blue frosting, because blue was his favorite color and had been since he was 4 years old, back when his mother was still alive to ask him questions like that. He'd placed the container on the edge of his tray, like a centerpiece at a table for one. He'd even stuck a single birthday candle in the top. He didn't have a lighter, he just liked the way it looked. Like something was supposed to happen. Nobody came. Across the cafeteria, a man named Russell Tate was refilling the napkin dispensers near the serving station. He was 47 years old, a widower, and he had worked as a school custodian at Millhaven Middle School in Denton, Ohio, for 11 years. He knew the cafeteria the way a sailor knows a harbor, every corner, every current, every kid who sat where. He noticed when tables shifted, he noticed when chairs went empty, and he noticed, with the particular radar of a man who had spent years quietly watching children move through the world, the boy sitting alone at table 14, with a cupcake and an unlit candle. Russell set down the napkin dispenser. He looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he walked over. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what Russell Tate's life had looked like for the past 6 years. His wife, Deborah, had died of an aggressive form of ovarian cancer when their daughter Junie was 9 years old. She was gone in 7 months, from diagnosis to funeral, fast enough that Russell still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, certain she was in the other room, that the whole thing had been a dream, that he would walk down the hall and find her sitting at the kitchen table, with her reading glasses on, and a cup of decaf, and some novel she'd borrowed from the library. He never did. He always found the same empty kitchen. The same quiet that had settled over their house, like a second loss they hadn't braced for. He raised Junie alone, he figured it out. Breakfast and permission slips and parent-teacher conferences, and the kind of late-night conversations about grief that nobody prepares you for. He didn't do it perfectly, he did it the way most single parents do it, imperfectly, completely, without any real alternative. Junie was 15 now, she was doing all right. Better than all right actually. She was in the school play, she had a best friend named Cassidy, who called the house too often and too late, and Russell pretended to be annoyed by it. He wasn't, he loved the noise, he loved that she had someone, but he also remembered, with the kind of cellular memory that never fully fades, what it felt like to be small and invisible in a room full of people. He remembered Junie at 9, sitting at her mother's funeral in a dress that was slightly too big for her, because Deborah had bought it 2 months before she got sick, and Junie had been growing fast that year, sitting there in that too big dress and staring at a closed casket while adults talked around her like she wasn't there. He remembered thinking, someone should just sit down next to her. Someone should just be there. So as he saw Carter Whitby and his unlit candle, Russell didn't think twice. He pulled out the plastic chair across from the boy and sat down. "That cupcake for somebody special?" he asked. Carter looked up. He had the expression of a kid who had been hoping nobody would notice him, and had just been caught hoping, a complicated, split-second negotiation between wanting to disappear and wanting, just a little, to be seen. "It's my birthday," Carter said. Russell nodded slowly. "Happy birthday." Carter shrugged, the way 12-year-olds shrug when they don't want you to see how much something matters to them. "Thanks. You got a lighter for that candle?" "No." Russell reached into the breast pocket of his work shirt and produced a small box of matches. He kept them there for the utility room. He struck one, sheltered the flame with his palm against the cafeteria draft, and lit the candle. It was a small flame, just a birthday candle in a plastic container, on a cafeteria lunch tray. But in that particular moment, in that particular room, it looked enormous. Carter stared at it. Russell said, "You gonna make a wish?" The boy thought about it for a second, genuinely thought about it, the way kids do when you give them permission to want something out loud. Then he closed his eyes and he blew out the candle. He didn't tell Sol what he wished for. Russell didn't ask. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't happen often between adults and 12-year-olds. Then Carter opened the plastic container and broke the cupcake in half with his fingers, and slid one half across the tray without a word. Russell took it. "Thank you," Russell said. "You're the custodian, right?" Carter asked. "That's me. My dad says custodians are the most important people in a school." Russell smiled at that. "Your dad sounds smart." Carter's expression shifted slightly, just a flicker, but Russell caught it. "He used to say it," Carter said. He doesn't really say stuff like that anymore." That was how Russell first heard about Edmund Whitby. Edmund was Carter's father, 41 years old. He'd been a high school biology teacher for 12 years at a different school in the district. A man who, by every account, had been warm, present, funny, in that particular dry-wit way that made teenagers actually like him. Carter described him the way children describe parents who have gone somewhere unreachable. In the past tense, even though he was still alive. Carter's mother had died 2 years earlier, a blood clot. Sudden enough that they'd had no time to prepare, no hospital vigil, no chance to say things that needed to be said. She was there on a Tuesday, and gone by Thursday, and the Whitby household had not recovered in the time since. Edmund had stopped teaching. He'd taken a leave of absence that stretched into a resignation that nobody around him had the energy to fight. He got out of bed, technically, he fed Carter, technically. He paid the bills and signed the school forms, and showed up to the right places at the right times, with the mechanical accuracy of a man going through motions he no longer believed in. But he wasn't there, not really, and Carter, who was 12 and perceptive, and had no language yet for what he was watching his father do, felt the absence like a physical thing in the house, a shape where a person used to be. "He works from home now," Carter told Russell, on the second or third time they'd talked in the cafeteria. "He does data entry stuff. He doesn't really go out much." "Does he come to your school stuff?" Russell asked. Not prying, just asking. Carter paused a little too long. "He came to the science fair in April. It was October." Russell nodded. He didn't say anything. He understood that sometimes the most honest answers are the ones people give before they realize they've given them. The thing about Russell Tate was that he was not a man who inserted himself into other people's business. He had strong opinions about privacy. He had spent years watching well-meaning people barrel into other people's grief, with casseroles and advice and cheerful certainty that they knew exactly what the grieving person needed. And he had watched those people do damage without knowing it. He had made himself a rule early in his widowhood. If someone wants help, they'll find a way to ask for it. But Carter didn't have the tools to ask for anything. He was 12. He packed his own birthday cupcake, and brought it to school alone, and sat at a table by himself, and hoped, in the wordless animal way of children who have stopped expecting much, that something would happen. Something had. Russell started making small adjustments to his route through the cafeteria. He was always in the building, always working. There was never a shortage of things to clean at a middle school, but he started timing his breaks near table 14. He started sitting down when Carter sat alone, which was often. Not every day, but often enough. They talked about things that mattered and things that didn't. Carter was into astronomy, not casually, but specifically, with the focused intensity of a kid who had been reading about black holes and stellar formation since age 8. He knew things about the universe that made Russell feel pleasantly humble. He talked about NASA missions and exoplanet discovery with the same energy that other kids talked about video games or baseball. Russell told Carter about Junie, about Deborah. Not all at once, and not in the way adults sometimes overshare with children as though the child is a therapist, but naturally, in pieces, the way real conversations happen. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said one afternoon, simply, because Carter had been talking about his mother and it felt right to acknowledge that Russell understood something about that specific geography. Carter went quiet. Then, "Does it get better?" Russell thought about that for a long moment. He didn't want to lie. He didn't want to give the boy the easy answer that adults hand out like candy. "Yes, of course. Time heals everything." Because he knew from personal experience that those words, while occasionally true in the long run, feel like abandonment when you're in the middle of the bad part. "Different," Russell said finally. "It gets different." Carter nodded slowly, as though that answer, imperfect as it was more useful than a comfortable one would have been. Weeks passed. November came to Denton, Ohio, with its particular gray insistence, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply settles in and stays. Russell noticed that Carter started wearing the same jacket every day, a thin navy windbreaker that wasn't remotely adequate for November in Ohio. He didn't say anything about it. He started keeping a spare sweatshirt in his supply closet. One Wednesday morning he found Carter sitting outside the school at 6:45, 20 minutes before the doors opened, on the concrete steps in the thin jacket. Not distressed exactly. Just sitting there in the cold, looking at nothing in particular. Russell unlocked the side entrance and held the door open. "You want to wait inside?" Carter came in. He sat in the supply room on an upturned bucket and drank the hot cocoa Russell made from the packets he kept in his locker. Russell had teenagers. He understood the value of hot cocoa packets, and he explained, without being asked, that his father had had a bad night. That sometimes on bad nights the mornings were loud in ways Carter preferred to get away from. That he'd started leaving early to give things time to settle. Russell listened. He didn't offer advice. He didn't call anyone or threaten anything. He made cocoa and listened and said, "You can come in early when you need to." "Really? I'm always here at 6:30, Russell said. I opened the side door. From then on, Carter came in early sometimes, not every day. But on the bad days, the days when Edmund Whitby was somewhere inside his grief that his son couldn't reach, Carter showed up at the side door, and Russell let him in, and they sat in the supply room with hot cocoa, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. The thing nobody tells you about grief is that it isn't linear, and it isn't private. It radiates outward. It changes the temperature of a house. Children who live inside someone else's grief absorb it the way they absorb everything. Completely. Without the emotional vocabulary to name what's happening to them, just the lived experience of a world that has gotten smaller and quieter and less reliable than it used to be. Carter Whitby had absorbed 2 years of his father's disappearance into grief, and it had made him careful, watchful. He was the kind of kid who chose the table at the edge of the cafeteria, who walked close to walls in hallways, who had learned to take up as little space as possible, because taking up space attracted attention, and attention was unpredictable. He was funny when he let himself be. Russell had noticed that from the beginning, the dry, sideways humor, the timing. He made observations about the world around him that were precise and often genuinely hilarious in the understated way that Russell associated with people who had spent a lot of time observing, rather than participating. He had the wit of someone older than 12, and the loneliness of someone who had never had the right audience for it. He needed people. He just had no idea how to find them anymore. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, about 40 minutes after school let out. Russell was in the gymnasium replacing a pair of burned-out fluorescent tubes when he got a message through the school's intercom system asking him to come to the front office. He found Carter sitting in the plastic chair outside the vice principal's door. Not in trouble, just waiting. Beside him was Edmund Whitby. Russell recognized him from a photograph Carter had shown him once on a phone, a picture from a camping trip from 3 years ago, Edmund laughing in front of a campfire with Carter on his shoulders. The man in the front office was technically the same person, same jawline, same build, same eyes. But in the photograph Edmund had been present in the way people are present when they're happy. Fully there, taking up space, oriented outward toward the world. The Edmund Whitby in that chair was oriented inward. He had the particular quality of a person who had pulled the perimeter of his existence in very close, and was living inside a very small radius. He looked like a man who had been trying hard to hold things together, and was beginning to suspect he wasn't holding as much as he thought. He stood when Russell walked in. Carter introduced them with the slightly embarrassed formality of a kid who has been keeping two separate worlds from colliding, and is watching them collide now. "My dad," Carter said. "This is Mr. Tate." Edmund extended his hand. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. His voice was quieter than Russell expected. More careful. "Good things, I hope," Russell said. "Carter says you make the best hot cocoa in Denton." "Packets from my locker," Russell admitted. "Don't let the reputation get out of hand." Edmund almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but it got close. They spoke for a few minutes in the hallway outside the office. Briefly. Without agenda. While Carter watched them the way children watch when they've hoped for something, without letting themselves name it. Edmund had come in to talk to the vice principal about Carter's attendance, which had become an issue. Not because Carter was skipping school, but because Carter had been leaving early on some of the harder days, and the school had flagged it, and called Edmund in to discuss it. Edmund explained this to Russell, with the careful, precise language of a man who had accepted that he had failed at something, and was trying to be honest about it, without completely unraveling. He said he hadn't realized. He said Carter hadn't told him. He said he thought things were. And he paused. Here. The pause of a man confronting something uncomfortable. He said he thought things were more stable than they apparently were. Russell didn't say, "You've been disappearing into your grief for 2 years, and your son has been getting up before dawn to avoid the fallout." He didn't say any of the things that would have been both true and cruel. He said, "He's a remarkable kid." Edmund looked at Carter then, really looked, the way Russell had seen parents look when they suddenly see their child clearly after a period of not seeing them at all. There was something in Edmund's expression that was difficult to watch, not guilt exactly, more like the specific anguish of a person who has realized, in a single moment, the size of an absence they created without meaning to. "Yeah," Edmund said softly, "he is." Russell did not engineer what happened next. He was insistent about that later when people asked. He didn't set anything up, he didn't have a plan, he just didn't leave. He asked Carter if he and his dad wanted to grab something to eat. Not at a restaurant, because Russell knew Edmund's radius was small, and restaurants were loud. He meant the diner on Clement Street, which was quiet on Thursday afternoons, and had vinyl booths and terrible coffee and pie that was genuinely extraordinary. Carter looked at his father, Edmund looked at Russell, then Edmund said, "Sure." They walked to the diner, 3 of them. Carter talked about a recently announced space telescope mission the entire way, with the rapid confidence of a kid who has forgotten, temporarily, to be careful about how much space he takes up. Edmund listened. Occasionally he asked a question, a real question, not a parental engagement question but a genuine curiosity question, and Carter answered it and asked one back, and they had, without announcing it, a conversation, a real one. Russell watched it happen from across the table over bad coffee and excellent pie. It wasn't a transformation. He was clear-eyed about that. Edmund Whitby didn't walk into that diner a broken man and walk out a healed one. That's not how grief works, and that's not how people work, and Russell knew that better than almost anyone. Edmund was still pale and too thin, and careful in a way that suggested he'd learned to be careful after something terrible. He was still, in some fundamental sense, somewhere in the middle of the long non-linear process of reassembling a life after catastrophic loss. But he was at the table, he was looking at his son, he was asking real questions and listening to the answers. And Carter, who had been sitting alone at table 14 in the cafeteria, with an unlit birthday candle for 2 years. Carter was sitting at a booth on Clement Street in November, eating cherry pie and explaining orbital mechanics to his father, and his voice had a quality in it that Russell had not heard before. Ease. Just ease. Like a kid who had been allowed to come in from the cold. Over the weeks that followed, things shifted, not dramatically, not in the movie montage way where problems dissolve, and everyone emerges into sunlight with perfect clarity. More in the way that real things shift when real people make real effort, gradually, imperfectly, with setbacks and false starts, and moments where nothing seemed to be moving at all. Edmund called his therapist again. He'd stopped going 9 months earlier, in that specific way that grief sometimes masquerades as recovery. "I'm doing better, I don't need this anymore." And he called her back and made an appointment and went. And he kept going after that. He started coming to the school more often. Not because he was required to, but because Carter had started a small astronomy club, 12-year-olds and a star chart, and a donated telescope that the science teacher kept in a storage closet, and Edmund had asked quietly if he could help. He sat in on 2 sessions. By the 3rd session he was running the telescope and explaining aperture to a group of 7th graders, who had not signed up to learn about aperture, but found themselves genuinely engaged. Carter watched his father from across the room during those sessions. Russell noticed, because Russell was always somewhere around the school, on Thursday afternoons, when the astronomy club met. And Russell made it a point to notice things. Carter watched Edmund the way kids watch parents when they're relieved. Not ecstatically, not with great theatrical display, but with the quiet specific relief of someone who has been waiting in a cold hallway for a very long time and has just been let inside. Russell's own role in this was small. He knew that. He was not the hero of the story. He was at most the person who happened to notice a boy with an unlit candle and sat down. But he thought about that sometimes, about the chain of things that had to happen for that moment to occur. He had to be in the right part of the cafeteria, he had to have matches, he had to be the kind of man who had learned, from his own specific history of loss, that sometimes the most meaningful thing you can do is simply take up space next to someone who is sitting alone. Junie asked him once, in December, why he seemed lighter lately. "What do you mean?" he said. "I don't know," she said, in the way 15-year-olds have of knowing exactly what they mean, and not quite being willing to commit to it. "You just seem like something good happened." He thought about Carter and his birthday cupcake and the unlit candle. He thought about Edmund Whitby in a diner booth, asking real questions and listening to the answers. He thought about what it cost him to sit down at table 14, the answer being nothing. It had cost him nothing. Us and 3 minutes, and a box of matches, and what it had been worth. Something good happened, he agreed. The school's winter concert was on a Thursday evening in the third week of December. It was the kind of event that middle schools stage with more ambition than resources. A chorus in matching red shirts. A band that was enthusiastic if not technically precise. Decorations that the art teacher had been assembling since October. The gymnasium was warm and packed and smelled like coffee from the folding table PTA bake sale near the entrance. Carter was in the chorus. He had mentioned this to Russell approximately once, in passing, and then not mentioned it again, in the careful way that Carter had, of presenting things that mattered to him, while providing a clear exit if they didn't matter to anyone else. Russell came to the concert. He sat in the third row with Junie, who was doing him a favor by pretending to be interested in a middle school chorus when she could have been anywhere else on a Thursday night. He'd told Carter he might try to make it. He hadn't promised. He'd learned early with kids that you don't promise things you're not certain of, because kids remember promises with a specificity that adults underestimate. But he was there. He found Edmund in the crowd afterward, standing near the gymnasium doors with a paper cup of coffee, and an expression that Russell was beginning to learn to read, the expression Edmund had when he was trying, genuinely, and it was costing him something, and he was paying it anyway. Edmund had come, he was there. Carter came out of the chorus line and found his father first, in the way kids beeline for the person they want most in a room. Edmund caught him and hugged him, a real hug. The kind that means something, the kind that neither of them seemed to want to end too quickly. Then Carter looked up and found Russell standing nearby, and the expression on his face was one Russell was going to keep for a long time. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter than surprise. Something closer to the look of a person who has started, tentatively, to expect good things again. "You came," Carter said. "I came," Russell said. A few weeks into January, Carter stopped coming through the side door in the early mornings. Russell noticed. He didn't ask about it. He figured Carter would tell him if something was wrong, and Carter did not tell him anything was wrong. And eventually, at lunch one Tuesday, Carter explained without being asked that he didn't need to come in early anymore. "Things are better at home," he said. Russell nodded. "Good, my dad started cooking again," Carter said. "Actual food, not just cereal and sandwiches. What does he make?" Carter thought about it. He made his mother's pot roast last Sunday. He cried a little while he was making it. Russell nodded. He knew exactly what that was about. "Was that okay?" he asked. "Yeah," Carter said. "I think it was actually pretty okay." He paused. "We talked about my mom while we ate. First time we really talked about her since she died." Russell didn't say anything for a moment. The cafeteria was loud around them, the specific noise of 200 middle schoolers at lunch, trays clattering and voices layered over voices. And in the middle of all that noise, this small table was quiet, in the way it always was when they were sitting there. "How was that?" Russell asked finally. Carter looked at him, 12 years old with the eyes of a kid who has been older than 12 for a while now. "It was really hard," he said. "And really good, at the same time." Russell said, "Yeah. That's usually how it goes." By February, Edmund had returned to teaching. Not at his old school. He applied for an open position at Millhaven, Carter's school, and they hired him, and he started in the middle of the semester, which is always a strange time to start, but sometimes you take the opening when it presents itself. He taught 7th and 8th grade biology. He wore a tie on Mondays because he believed biology teachers should wear ties on Mondays, and Carter thought this was mortifying, and Edmund thought Carter's mortification was wonderful. He was visible now. Present. Oriented outward toward the world again. Not without cost. Grief doesn't disappear, it just learns to live alongside you, but genuinely there in the way he hadn't been for a long time. He and Russell saw each other in the hallways. They had lunch in the break room on Tuesdays sometimes. They talked about the things colleagues talk about, and occasionally the deeper things that only happen between people who have seen each other in the middle of something real. "I don't know how to thank you," Edmund said once. Simply. Russell considered this. "You sat in a cold diner in November with a kid who wanted to talk about telescopes," he said. "That's not nothing, that's everything." Edmund looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly. "Yeah, it was." Russell thought about Deborah sometimes, at the end of days like these. Not painfully anymore, or not only painfully, grief does change shape, even if it doesn't disappear. He thought about the person she had been, and the things she had taught him, among them the basic but easily overlooked fact that most of what matters in a life is small. It's the matches in your shirt pocket. It's the open side door at 6:30 in the morning. It's the question you ask without knowing whether you'll get an answer. He thought about Carter at table 14 in October, with the unlit candle in the plastic container, in the middle of a cafeteria full of noise that had nothing to do with him. He thought about the moment he struck the match. He thought about how long it had been since anyone had done something that small for him. That exact combination of timing and presence, and the ordinary willingness to just sit down, and how much it had meant when they did. He thought about the way the flame looked in that particular draft, small and almost out, flickering but holding. He thought, that's all it takes. Most of the time, you just have to be willing to walk over, you have to be willing to sit down, you have to have matches, the rest of it, usually, takes care of itself. Before you go, if you know someone who has been sitting alone at their own table, carrying a birthday they haven't told anyone about, waiting for someone to notice, share this story with them. Leave a comment, and tell us where you're watching from. And if a stranger once sat down next to you when you needed it most, tell us about it. Those moments deserve to be heard. That's why we're here.